The cleaning cart squeaked as it rolled across the polished marble floor of Belmont Corporate Tower's main lobby. It was nearly midnight and the building stood mostly empty, except for the occasional security guard and the cleaning staff who came alive when the suits went home. Among them was Thomas Rivera, a man whose weathered hands had cleaned these floors for the past 4 years. At 43, his face carried the gentle lines of someone who smiled often despite life's hardships. His dark hair had started graying at the temples, and when he thought no one was looking, exhaustion sometimes showed in the slope of his shoulders. "Hey, Mr. Rivera, how's Zoe doing with that science project?" called out Darlene from across the lobby. She was wiping down the security desk, her bright yellow cleaning uniform standing out against the muted grays and blacks of the corporate decor. Thomas looked up and smiled. "She's building a model of the solar system. Our apartment looks like a glitter factory exploded." His eyes brightened when he spoke about his 12-year-old daughter. "She's determined to make it spin with some motor she salvaged from an old toy." "That girl's going places," Darlene nodded. "Smart like her daddy." Thomas shook his head with a humble laugh. "Smarter. Much smarter." The night cleaning crew at Belmont was like a second family to Thomas. They were the ones who had helped him figure out how to braid Zoe's hair when she was younger, who covered his shifts when she had a fever, who brought extra food during holidays. They knew his story, how he'd become a single father when his wife, Elena, passed away from complications after a routine surgery 3 years ago. What had been meant to be a simple procedure turned into a nightmare that left him raising their daughter alone, while drowning in medical bills. Before that day, Thomas had worked as an assistant music teacher at a local community center. The pay hadn't been great, but it had allowed him to pursue his passion for music while helping support his family. Elena had been the main breadwinner as a nurse. When she died, everything changed. The music teaching job didn't provide enough to cover the bills that kept piling up. With no college degree and limited options, Thomas had taken the night cleaning job at Belmont. It paid better than teaching music part-time, and the hours meant he could see Zoe off to school in the mornings and be there when she got home. He'd sleep while she was at school, then help with homework before heading to work at 10 p.m. "Floor 62 tonight, right?" Thomas asked, checking his assignment sheet. "Yeah, the executive floor," Darlene said with a slight eye roll. "Make sure you dust their fancy awards extra special." The executive floor was both the easiest and hardest to clean. Easiest because the executives were neater than most, with personal assistants who tidied up after them. Hardest because everything was expensive and delicate, and because the cleaning staff were reminded of their place in the world with every crystal paperweight they carefully dusted. Thomas wheeled his cart to the elevator and pressed the button for the 62nd floor. As the doors closed, he caught his reflection in the mirrored wall. His uniform was clean but worn, the blue fabric faded from countless washes. He straightened his shoulders and ran a hand through his hair. His mother had always told him that dignity wasn't about what you did for a living, but how you carried yourself while doing it. The elevator doors opened to a silent floor of glass-walled offices and expensive furniture. Thomas moved quietly, starting his routine of emptying trash bins, vacuuming carpets, and wiping down surfaces. He worked methodically, taking pride in leaving everything spotless. As he cleaned, his mind wandered to the stack of bills waiting at home. Zoe needed new shoes again. Kids grew so fast at this age. The rent was due next week, and the refrigerator had been making a concerning noise lately. He'd been putting money aside for piano lessons for Zoe, who had inherited his love for music, but those savings might need to go toward repairs instead. While dusting the bookshelf in the CEO's office, Thomas's eyes fell on a framed family photo. The CEO, a woman named Vivian Chen, stood smiling with her husband and 2 children in front of what looked like a vacation home. They all wore matching sweaters and looked genuinely happy. Thomas didn't resent people for having more than him. His parents had raised him to believe that envy was a waste of energy. But sometimes he wondered what it would be like to not worry about money all the time, to be able to take Zoe on a real vacation instead of their staycations, where they explored free museums and parks around the city. He moved to the corner of the CEO's office where a baby grand piano sat. More decorative than functional, Thomas had noticed it on previous cleaning assignments and always took extra care with it. Tonight, after checking that the floor was empty, he gently lifted the cover and ran his fingertips lightly over the keys without pressing down. feeling their smooth coolness. Before Elena died, they'd had an old upright piano in their apartment. It had been his grandmother's, out of tune but full of memories. He'd had to sell it to pay for part of the funeral expenses. Now the only time he touched a piano was during these quiet moments at work or occasionally at the community center when he volunteered for Zoe's school events. Thomas carefully closed the piano cover and continued with his work, humming softly to himself. Music had always been his way of processing emotions, of finding peace in chaos. The melodies in his head were complex and beautiful, but few people ever heard them anymore. At 3 a.m., Thomas took his break in the employee lounge on the ground floor. He unwrapped the sandwich he'd made before leaving home, peanut butter and banana, Zoe's favorite that had become his too. He checked his phone and smiled at the goodnight text from his daughter. Hope work isn't too boring. Love you to Pluto and back, that's farther than the moon, you know. He texted back a heart emoji, not wanting to wake her if she was asleep. Zoe worried about him working nights, about him being tired all the time. She'd offered to get a paper route to help with money, which had both warmed his heart and broken it a little. At 12, her main concern should be friends and schoolwork, not helping her dad pay bills. Your kid still up? Asked Ramon, another member of the cleaning staff who was microwaving what smelled like leftover curry. No, she just texted goodnight earlier, Thomas replied. How's your mom doing? Ramon sighed as he sat down. Better, I think. The new medication seems to be helping with her arthritis. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, two men taking a brief rest in the middle of a long night of work. The conversation eventually turned to the upcoming company party that the cleaning staff had been preparing for all week. Heard they're bringing in some fancy catering, Ramon said between bites. And a live band. Yeah, and guess who'll be cleaning up after them? Thomas said with a wry smile. At least they're paying us overtime, Ramon shrugged. I could use the extra cash. After break, Thomas finished the executive floor and moved down to level 61. As he worked, he thought about the piano in the CEO's office. Sometimes he imagined playing it, really playing it, filling the empty building with music. In another life, he might have been performing in concert halls instead of cleaning them. Thomas had been good enough to earn a partial scholarship to a music school after high school, but not good enough for a full ride. Without the means to pay for the rest, he'd put his dreams aside and taken practical jobs. He'd kept playing, though, finding gigs at bars and weddings, teaching lessons when he could. Music had been the background rhythm of his life until grief and necessity had muted it. When his shift ended at 6 a.m., Thomas clocked out and stepped into the early morning light. The city was just waking up, street vendors setting up their carts, early commuters hurrying past with coffee cups in hand. Thomas's body ached from the night's work, but he walked with purpose toward the bus stop. He'd be home in time to make Zoe breakfast before school. As he waited for the bus, he noticed a street musician setting up nearby, unpacking an old violin. Without thinking, Thomas dropped $1, one of the few in his wallet, into the open case. The violinist nodded in thanks. You play? The man asked, noticing how Thomas watched him tune the instrument. Used to, Thomas replied with a small smile. Piano mostly. Never too late to start again, the violinist said, beginning to play a cheerful melody that followed Thomas onto the bus. Never too late. The words echoed in Thomas's mind as the bus carried him home. Maybe the violinist was right. Maybe someday when Zoe was older and things were more stable, he could find his way back to music. For now, though, his symphony was the sound of his daughter's laughter, the quiet moments they shared over breakfast, the knowledge that his work, however humble, kept a roof over their heads and food on their table. As the bus rumbled through the awakening city, Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. In his mind, he was playing that baby grand in the CEO's office, his fingers dancing across the keys, creating something beautiful. The music in his head carried him home, a private concert that no one else could hear, but that sustained him nonetheless. When he stepped off the bus, the weight of exhaustion heavy on his shoulders, Thomas thought about the coming day, making breakfast, helping Zoe with her science project, catching a few hours of sleep, then doing it all again. It wasn't the life he'd dreamed of as a young man with music in his heart, but it was a life filled with purpose and love, and for now that had to be enough. The bus ride home from Belmont Tower always felt shorter than the journey there. Thomas leaned his head against the window, watching the city transform from sleek skyscrapers to the more modest buildings of his neighborhood. His eyes felt heavy, but his mind was already thinking about breakfast. Zoe liked scrambled eggs with cheese on school days. When Thomas unlocked the door to their two-bedroom apartment, he found Zoe already awake and dressed in her school uniform, her hair pulled back in a slightly lopsided ponytail. She was hunched over the kitchen table, glue gun in hand, attaching what looked like a small motor to a cardboard base. "Morning, Dad," she called out without looking up, her tongue stuck out in concentration. "I think I figured out how to make Saturn spin." Thomas smiled as he hung up his jacket. "Already? It's not even 7. He walked over and kissed the top of her head. "Your ponytail's crooked. Want me to fix it?" Zoe nodded, still focused on her project. Thomas gently removed the hair tie and brushed her dark hair with his fingers before redoing the ponytail. His hands had gotten better at this over the years, though he still couldn't manage the fancy braids that Elena used to create. "How was work?" Zoe asked, finally looking up. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, studied his face with a maturity beyond her 12 years. "Same as always," Thomas replied, moving to the refrigerator. "Cleaned the executive floors. Dusted a lot of fancy things." He pulled out eggs and cheese. "The CEO has a beautiful piano in her office. Did you play it?" Zoe asked, her eyes lighting up. Thomas laughed softly. "No, honey. I just dusted it. That piano probably costs more than our rent for a year. You should play it sometime." "When nobody's there," Zoe suggested, turning back to her project. "I bet they wouldn't even know." Thomas cracked eggs into a bowl, adding a splash of milk and a pinch of salt. "And risk losing my job? No way. Now tell me more about this spinning Saturn." As they ate breakfast, Zoe explained her solar system project in detail. Thomas listened attentively, asking questions and offering suggestions despite his exhaustion. These morning conversations were precious to him, small windows into his daughter's world that he wouldn't trade for anything. After dropping Zoe at school, Thomas returned to their apartment. He washed the breakfast dishes, put in a load of laundry, and paid a few bills online, wincing at how the numbers in their bank account shrank. Then he set his alarm for 2 p.m. and collapsed into bed, still wearing his socks. Sleep came quickly but brought with it dreams of music. In his dream, Thomas sat at a grand piano on an empty stage, playing a piece he'd composed years ago but never performed publicly. The melody flowed from his fingers like water, filling the empty hall with sound. He could feel the vibrations of the notes through the bench, through his feet on the pedals. It was the kind of dream that felt so real that waking was a disappointment. The alarm jarred him from sleep all too soon. Thomas showered quickly and changed into jeans and a faded blue t-shirt. He had 3 hours before Zoe would be home from her after-school program, just enough time for his weekly visit to Happy Oaks retirement home. The retirement home was a 15-minute walk from their apartment. Thomas had started volunteering there 6 months ago, playing the old upright piano in the community room for an hour each week. The piano was out of tune with several keys that stuck, but it was better than no piano at all. "Thomas, right on time," called Mrs. Henderson, the activities director, when he walked in. She was a plump woman with bright red glasses and an ever-present clipboard. "They're all waiting for you in the community room. Mr. Delaney has been asking about you all morning." Thomas smiled as he signed the visitor log. "How is he doing?" "Better than last week." Mrs. Henderson's smile faltered slightly. "About the same. Good days and bad days, you know. But he always perks up for your music." The community room was filled with elderly residents in wheelchairs and walkers, arranged in a semicircle around the piano. A few family members sat with them, making small talk or helping with cups of tea. When Thomas entered, several faces lit up with recognition. "There he is," called Mr. Delaney, a former high school music teacher whose mind was slowly being claimed by dementia. "The maestro arrives." Thomas waved as he made his way to the piano. "Not a maestro, Mr. Delaney. Just a guy who likes to play." "Nonsense," Mr. Delaney insisted, his eyes clearer than usual today. "I taught music for 40 years. I know talent when I hear it." Thomas sat at the piano, flexing his fingers before placing them on the keys. He never brought sheet music. He didn't need it. Instead, he let his fingers find their way, starting with gentle classics that the residents would recognize. Debussy's Clair de Lune, some Chopin nocturnes, a bit of Mozart. As he played, he watched the faces around him. Mrs. Liu closed her eyes, swaying slightly to the rhythm. Mr. Patel tapped his cane in time with the music. In the corner, a woman whose name Thomas didn't know yet silently wept, though she was smiling through her tears. This was why he kept playing despite everything. Music reached people in ways that words couldn't. It connected them to memories, to emotions, to parts of themselves that remained intact even when other things were falling apart. After about 40 minutes, Thomas transitioned to more upbeat tunes, some ragtime, a few simplified jazz standards, even some Billy Joel and Elton John. A few of the more mobile residents got up to dance, holding on to each other or their walkers for support. Play the one about the river, called Mrs. Gonzalez, a former dance instructor who now used a wheelchair. The one you wrote. Thomas hesitated. The piece she was requesting was one he'd composed after Elena died. It was called River of Memory, and it was the most personal thing he'd ever written. He'd played it here only once before, but they hadn't forgotten. Please, Mrs. Gonzalez added, and several others nodded in agreement. Taking a deep breath, Thomas began to play. The melody started simply, like a small stream, then gradually built in complexity and emotion like a river gathering strength. It was about loss, yes, but also about how memories carried forward. How love continued to flow even when the person was gone. As he played, Thomas closed his eyes, letting himself be carried by the music. For these few minutes, he wasn't a night janitor struggling to make ends meet. He was just a musician, speaking the language he knew best. When the final notes faded, the room remained silent for a moment before erupting in applause. Thomas opened his eyes to see Mr. Delaney wiping tears from his cheeks. That, Mr. Delaney said firmly, belongs in a concert hall. Thomas shook his head modestly. I'm happy it's here with all of you. After playing a few more requests, Thomas's hour was up. As he was saying his goodbyes, Mr. Delaney grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Don't waste it, the older man said, his eyes suddenly intense and focused. Promise me. Don't let your music die inside you. Thomas patted the man's hand gently. I promise I'll be back next week, Mr. Delaney. That's not what I mean, and you know it, Mr. Delaney insisted. Your talent. It's not just for us old folks. The world should hear it. Thomas carefully extracted his hand. I've got to pick up my daughter from school now. I'll see you next Thursday, okay? As he walked out, Mrs. Henderson caught up with him. He's right, you know, she said quietly. You're really gifted, Thomas. Have you ever thought about doing something more with your music? Thomas smiled politely but didn't answer directly. See you next week, Mrs. Henderson. The question followed him as he walked to Zoe's school. Of course he'd thought about doing more with his music. Before Elena died, they'd talked about him going back to school, maybe getting a proper music degree, teaching at a college level instead of just the community center. But life had other plans. When he reached the school, Zoe was waiting at the front gate deep in conversation with her best friend Lily. She spotted him and waved goodbye to Lily before running over. Dad, guess what? Ms. Wilson says my solar system might win first prize at the science fair, she exclaimed, her backpack bouncing as she ran. That's amazing, kiddo, Thomas said, his worries momentarily forgotten as he hugged her. Tell me all about it on the way home. That evening, after dinner and homework, Thomas sat on their small balcony while Zoe took a shower. From his pocket, he pulled out a folded flyer that Mrs. Henderson had pressed into his hand as he was leaving. It advertised open auditions for a local orchestra, not a professional one, but a well-respected community group. Thomas stared at the date. It was in 2 weeks on his day off. He could do it, maybe, but then what? Even if he got in, rehearsals would eat into his time with Zoe. And it paid nothing. It was a volunteer orchestra. He was about to crumple the flyer when Zoe stepped onto the balcony. Her hair wet from the shower. What's that? She asked, peering over his shoulder. Thomas hesitated, then handed her the flyer. Just something Mrs. Henderson gave me. Zoe read it quickly, her face lighting up. Dad, you have to do this. You'd totally get in. It's not that simple, Zoe. Why not? She challenged. You're amazing. Everyone at Happy Oak says so. Thomas sighed. Even if I got in, rehearsals are Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Who would be with you? I could go to Lily's after school those days, Zoe suggested immediately. Her mom already said I could come over any time. Or I could go to the community center. I'm old enough. Thomas looked at his daughter. So earnest, so supportive. She'd lost so much, yet here she was, encouraging him to pursue his dreams. I'll think about it, he promised. folding the flyer and putting it back in his pocket. That night, before leaving for work, Thomas paused in front of the small digital keyboard they'd bought at a garage sale last year. It was nothing like a real piano. The keys were too light, the sound tinny, but it was all they could afford. He sat down and played a few notes, the familiar sensation both comforting and painful. Music had been his first love before Elena, before Zoe. It had always been there, even when he couldn't give it the attention it deserved. Don't let your music die inside you. Mr. Delaney's words echoed in his mind as he locked the apartment and headed to the bus stop. Maybe the old music teacher was right. Maybe it was time to let the music out, even if just a little. The thought both terrified and excited him as he boarded the bus that would take him back to Belmont Tower, back to his mop and cleaning cart, back to the life he'd never imagined for himself, but somehow had to make work. The week of the company party at Belmont Tower arrived with a flurry of activity. Thomas and the rest of the cleaning staff had been given special instructions to make the building spotless, with particular attention to the executive lounge on the 62nd floor where the event would be held. They're sparing no expense this year, Darlene told Thomas as they rode the elevator up together on Tuesday night. I heard they hired some fancy chef from that restaurant downtown, the one with the month-long waiting list. Thomas nodded, pushing his cleaning cart onto the executive floor. Ramon said they're bringing in a grand piano just for the party. A piano? Darlene raised an eyebrow. Who's going to play it? Some professional pianist, I guess. Thomas shrugged, trying to sound casual. For background music during dinner. The truth was, the news about the piano had been occupying his thoughts all day. He'd overheard two executives discussing it while he was emptying trash bins the night before. Apparently, the pianist they'd hired was a former child prodigy who now played with the City Symphony as Thomas cleaned the executive bathrooms, making sure the marble countertops gleamed and the brass fixtures shone. He couldn't help but wonder what it would be like to play a truly fine instrument again. The piano at Happy Oaks was serviceable but worn. The digital keyboard at home was even more limited. A concert grand piano was a different beast entirely. Responsive, expressive, capable of the full range of dynamics that made music come alive. You're quiet tonight, Darlene commented when they took their break together in the employee lounge. Everything okay with Zoe? Thomas pulled himself from his thoughts. Yeah, she's great. Won first place in her science fair yesterday. Her solar system had all these moving parts. God, that's wonderful. Darlene's face lit up. Smart kid, that one. She wants me to audition for a community orchestra, Thomas said, surprising himself by sharing this. He hadn't told anyone about the flyer except Zoe. Darlene stopped mid-bite of her sandwich. An orchestra? You play an instrument? Thomas nodded. Piano. I used to teach at the community center before. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone on the night crew knew about his wife. Well, I'll be, Darlene said, looking at him with new interest. 4 years working together and I'm just now finding this out. Are you any good? Thomas gave a half smile. I was once. Then you should do it, Darlene said firmly. That girl of yours has the right idea. By Thursday night, the preparations for Friday's party were in their final stages. The executive lounge had been transformed, with rented furniture and decorations replacing the usual corporate sterility. And there, in the corner by the floor-to-ceiling windows with their view of the city skyline, stood the piano. It wasn't just any grand piano. It was a Steinway Model D, the same kind used in concert halls around the world. Thomas recognized it immediately, having spent countless hours in music school drooling over catalog pictures of such instruments, knowing he could never afford one. Beautiful, isn't it? Said a voice behind him. Thomas turned to see Harold, one of the security guards who patrolled the executive floors. It's a Steinway, Thomas said, unable to keep the reverence from his voice. Harold chuckled. Just looks like a big black piano to me, but if you say so. Thomas wanted nothing more than to sit down and play it, to feel those perfectly weighted keys beneath his fingers. But the room was bustling with party planners and caterers setting up for tomorrow's event. Instead, he went back to his cleaning duties, stealing glances at the piano whenever he could. Around 2 a.m., the party planners finally left. The executive lounge was ready, tables draped in white linen, crystal glasses sparkling under the dimmed lights. flower arrangements adding splashes of color throughout the room. And the piano, its lid propped open, waited silently. Thomas finished mopping the adjacent hallway, then returned to the lounge to collect his cleaning supplies. The room was empty now. Even Harold had moved to a different floor on his patrol route. For a long moment, Thomas stood looking at the piano. It was as if it were calling to him, like in those cartoons Zoe watched where characters float toward enticing smells. Before he could talk himself out of it, Thomas set down his mop and walked over to the instrument. He ran his hand lightly over the polished ebony surface, admiring the craftsmanship. The piano tuner had been there earlier in the day. He could tell by the adjustment tools left in a small case nearby. The instrument would be perfectly in tune. Thomas glanced at his watch. It was 2:17 a.m. His shift ended at 6. No one would be coming to the executive floor at this hour. Just one piece, he whispered to himself. Just to know what it feels like. He sat down on the bench, adjusting it to the right height. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. If someone caught him, he could lose his job. But the temptation was too great. Gently, reverently, Thomas placed his hands on the keys. He started with a simple C major scale just to feel the action of the keys. The response was immediate, the sound rich and full even though he was barely touching the keys. It was like the difference between driving a luxury car and a 20-year-old sedan. Same basic function, completely different experience. Encouraged, Thomas began to play softly. He chose a Chopin nocturne, one he'd played countless times before. The music flowed from his fingers, filling the empty room with sound. He closed his eyes, letting muscle memory guide him through the familiar piece. When he finished, the final notes hanging in the air, Thomas sat still for a moment, eyes still closed, savoring the experience. Then he heard a small sound, the shuffling of feet. His eyes flew open. Harold, the security guard, stood in the doorway, mouth slightly open in surprise. "I'm sorry," Thomas said quickly, standing up from the bench. "I know I shouldn't have." Harold held up a hand. I don't even have words, man. I had no idea you could play like that." Thomas felt his face grow warm. "Please don't report me. I just wanted to try it once." Harold seemed to consider this for a moment, then shook his head. "I didn't see anything, but maybe—" He trailed off, looking thoughtful. "Maybe what?" Thomas asked. "Maybe you could play something else? Just one more piece? I've never heard anything like that before." Relieved that he wasn't about to lose his job, Thomas hesitated only briefly before sitting back down. "Any request?" Harold shrugged. "Something. I don't know. Something happy." Thomas thought for a moment, then began to play Debussy's Gollywog's Cakewalk, a playful piece with a catchy rhythm. Harold leaned against the doorframe, a smile spreading across his face as he listened. When Thomas finished, Harold applauded softly. "That was amazing. Seriously? Why are you cleaning floors when you can do that?" It was a question Thomas had asked himself many times over the past few years. "Life happens," he said simply. "Bills need to be paid." Harold nodded in understanding. "Well, your secret's safe with me. But you should play again sometime. For real, I mean, not just when no one's supposed to be listening." After Harold continued on his rounds, Thomas carefully closed the piano lid and returned to his cleaning cart. His heart felt lighter than it had in months. Playing that magnificent instrument had awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long. Friday night arrived, and with it came the special overtime shift for the cleaning crew. They weren't there to clean. That had all been done in advance. Instead, they were there to handle any spills or messes during the party, to restock bathrooms and to remain invisible in the background while the company executives and their guests enjoyed themselves. Thomas was stationed near the executive lounge, dressed in a slightly nicer version of his usual uniform. Through the open doors, he could see the party in full swing. Men in expensive suits and women in cocktail dresses mingled, champagne glasses in hand. The catering staff circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres, and in the corner the pianist, a young man with slicked back hair and a bow tie, played classical pieces that barely registered above the din of conversation. "Fancy crowd, huh?" Ramon appeared beside Thomas, holding a spray bottle and cloth. "I just had to clean up red wine from the carpet in the hallway. Some VP's wife got a little too enthusiastic with her gestures." Thomas nodded, his eyes still on the party. "Have you seen Ms. Chen yet?" he asked, referring to the CEO. Arrived about 10 minutes ago, Ramon confirmed. Made a big entrance, gave a short speech about record profits, and now she's working the room. Just then, a commotion near the piano caught their attention. The young pianist had stopped playing and was engaged in what appeared to be a heated conversation with a man Thomas recognized as Mr. Phillips, the head of marketing. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that the pianist looked upset. "Wonder what that's about," Ramon murmured. They didn't have to wonder long. Minutes later, Ms. Rodriguez, the head of human resources, approached them looking flustered. "We have a situation," she said without preamble. The pianist just quit. Apparently, Mr. Phillips made some comment about his playing being just background noise and asked if he knew any real music instead of that classical stuff. The pianist took offense, and now he's gone. "That's unfortunate," Thomas said carefully, unsure why she was telling them this. Ms. Rodriguez ran a hand through her hair. "Ms. Chen is not happy. The pianist was supposed to play during dinner, which is being served in 20 minutes. Do either of you know anyone who could fill in? Any of the cleaning staff have musical talents they've been hiding?" She said it as a joke, clearly not expecting an answer. Thomas felt his heart begin to race. This was the moment to speak up, to reveal his hidden talent. But fear kept him silent, fear of drawing attention to himself, of potentially embarrassing himself in front of the company executives, of somehow making things worse. Before he could decide what to do, Harold appeared in the hallway. The security guard's eyes met Thomas's, and a slow smile spread across his face. "Actually," Harold said, stepping forward, "I might know someone who could help." Thomas felt his stomach drop as Harold's words hung in the air. Ms. Rodriguez looked at the security guard with sudden interest. "Really? Who?" she asked, desperation clear in her voice. Harold grinned and clapped a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "This guy right here. He's amazing." Ms. Rodriguez turned to Thomas with raised eyebrows. "You play piano?" Thomas shot Harold a panicked look before answering. Yes, but I don't think—" "I heard him the other night," Harold interrupted. "Trust me, he's better than the guy who just left." Ms. Rodriguez looked Thomas up and down, taking in his cleaning uniform with a skeptical expression. "What kind of music do you play?" "Classical, mostly," Thomas replied, his mouth dry. "Some jazz. A bit of everything, really." She seemed to be weighing her options, which Thomas suspected were limited. "Have you ever performed before?" "Professionally, I mean." "I used to teach music," Thomas said quietly. "And I've played at weddings, community events." "Nothing fancy." Ms. Rodriguez glanced at her watch, then back at the party where Ms. Chen was now looking in their direction, with a questioning expression. "Well, I suppose we don't have much choice. Can you fill in? Just for an hour or so during dinner? We'll pay you, of course." Thomas felt like he was standing at a crossroads. Part of him wanted to say no, to retreat to the safety of invisibility. But another part, the part that still dreamed of making music for a living, was pushing him forward. "I'd need to change," he said, looking down at his uniform. Ms. Rodriguez nodded quickly. "We can find you something. Follow me." 10 minutes later, Thomas found himself in the men's restroom, changing into a borrowed suit jacket and tie that belonged to someone in the accounting department. They were slightly too big, but better than his cleaning uniform. His heart was pounding so hard he could barely button the shirt. "You okay in there?" Harold called through the door. Thomas opened the door, adjusting the unfamiliar tie. "Not really. I can't believe I agreed to this." Harold smiled encouragingly. "You've got nothing to worry about. I heard you play, remember? You're going to blow them away. Or I'll freeze up and humiliate myself in front of the entire company," Thomas muttered. "That's not going to happen," Harold said firmly. "Think of it this way, if you mess up, what's the worst that could happen? They already think you're just a janitor." Thomas winced at the blunt assessment, but Harold had a point. The executive's expectations would be low. Maybe that was a good thing. Ms. Rodriguez reappeared, looking harried. "They're seating for dinner now. Are you ready?" Thomas took a deep breath and nodded. The executive lounge had been transformed into a dining area, with round tables elegantly set for the company's top brass and their guests. The Steinway stood in the corner, illuminated by soft lighting. All eyes turned to Thomas as Ms. Rodriguez led him to the piano. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with a professional smile. "Our scheduled pianist had a family emergency, but fortunately, we have a talented replacement. Please enjoy your dinner with musical accompaniment by—" She faltered, realizing she didn't know his full name. Thomas Rivera, he supplied quietly. By Thomas Rivera, she concluded, giving him an encouraging nod before walking away. Thomas sat at the piano bench, acutely aware of the curious glances from the diners. Most had already dismissed him, returning to their conversations. A few watched with polite interest. Near the center of the room, at what was clearly the most important table, sat Miss Chen, the CEO. She wasn't looking at him at all, engaged in conversation with an older gentleman to her right. For a moment, Thomas froze. What was he doing here? He didn't belong in this world of wealth and power. He belonged behind a mop, invisible and unnoticed. Then he thought of Zoe, who believed in him completely, of Mr. Delaney at the retirement home, who recognized his talent even through the fog of dementia, of the flyer for the orchestra auditions, still in his jacket pocket at home. Thomas placed his hands on the keys and began to play. He started with something safe, a Beethoven piece that was familiar enough to provide pleasant background music, without demanding too much attention. His fingers were stiff at first, his posture rigid with tension. But gradually, as the music flowed, he began to relax. No one seemed to be paying much attention, which was both a relief and slightly disappointing. The waitstaff moved silently between tables, serving the first course. Conversation and the clink of silverware provided a steady backdrop to his playing. Thomas transitioned smoothly into a Mozart sonata, then a Chopin waltz. He kept the volume moderate, appropriate for dinner music. This wasn't a performance, he reminded himself. He was just providing atmosphere, like the flower arrangements or the lighting. After about 20 minutes, when the main course was being served, Thomas decided to take a small risk. Instead of another classical piece, he began to play a jazz standard, Autumn Leaves, arranged in his own style that blended classical technique with jazz harmonies. The change was subtle at first, but as the piece progressed, he noticed something. The volume of conversation in the room had decreased slightly. A few heads had turned toward the piano. Encouraged, Thomas let himself get lost in the music, adding flourishes and improvised passages that showcased his skill without being showy. By the time he finished that piece, there was a smattering of applause from a nearby table. Thomas nodded in acknowledgement, surprised and pleased. He moved into another jazz piece, this one more upbeat. As he played, he caught movement from the corner of his eye. Someone was approaching the piano. Thomas glanced up to see Mr. Phillips, the marketing executive who had insulted the previous pianist, standing beside him with 2 glasses of champagne. He set one on top of the piano. "That's more like it," Mr. Phillips said with approval. "The other fellow was talented, I suppose, but too stuffy. This has life to it." Thomas nodded his thanks, continuing to play as Mr. Phillips returned to his table. The champagne sat untouched. Thomas never drank while playing, and certainly not on the job, even this unusual version of his job. For the next piece, Thomas took a bigger risk. He began to play one of his own compositions, not River of Memory, which was too personal and emotional for this setting, but a piece he'd written called City Lights, inspired by the view of the city at night from Belmont Tower. The composition started simply, with a repeating pattern in the left hand that suggested the rhythm of city life. The right hand introduced a melody that soared above it, like streetlights coming on one by one as darkness fell. As the piece developed, it incorporated elements of different musical styles, classical structure, jazz harmonies, even hints of blues and folk, representing the diverse sounds of urban life. Thomas was so absorbed in the music that he didn't immediately notice the change in the room. When the piece ended, he was startled by the sound of enthusiastic applause, not just from one table, but from throughout the room. He looked up to see that many of the diners had stopped eating to listen. And there, standing just a few feet from the piano, was Ms. Chen. The CEO was a small woman with an elegant bearing and penetrating eyes. She was watching Thomas with an expression he couldn't quite read. "That was remarkable," she said when the applause died down. "I don't recognize the piece." "Thank you," Thomas replied, his voice barely audible. "It's something I wrote." Ms. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. "You're a composer as well as a pianist?" Thomas nodded, unsure what else to say. "And where did you study?" she asked, taking a step closer. "I had a partial scholarship to the State Conservatory," Thomas answered honestly, "but I couldn't afford to complete the program." Ms. Chen seemed to be studying him with new interest. And now you play at events like this? Thomas hesitated. Should he tell her the truth? Before he could decide, Harold appeared at the CEO's elbow. Ms. Chen, the security guard said respectfully, Mr. Rivera actually works for Belmont Tower. He's on the night cleaning staff. There was a moment of stunned silence. Ms. Chen's expression changed from surprise to something more complex. Is that true? She asked Thomas directly. Thomas straightened his shoulders, meeting her gaze. Yes, ma'am. For 4 years now. Instead of the dismissal or embarrassment he expected, Ms. Chen smiled, a small, thoughtful smile that transformed her serious face. Well, she said, it seems we've been overlooking a considerable talent. Please continue playing, and I'd like to speak with you after the dinner concludes. As she walked back to her table, Thomas could see people whispering, looking at him with new curiosity. He had been unmasked, his double life revealed. But instead of the humiliation he had feared, he felt something unexpected, a sense of relief and perhaps even pride. For the next hour, Thomas played with newfound confidence. He mixed classical pieces with jazz standards and a few more of his own compositions. The room had changed. People were listening now, really listening. When dessert was served, several guests made requests, which Thomas fulfilled if he knew the pieces. Mr. Phillips came back to the piano, this time with a napkin on which he'd written his email address. My daughter's getting married next spring, he explained. We've been looking for someone special to play at the ceremony. Would you be interested? Before Thomas could answer, another executive approached with a similar request for an upcoming anniversary party. Then another, asking if Thomas gave private lessons. By the time the dinner ended and guests began to move to another area for drinks, Thomas had a small collection of business cards and napkins with contact information. His head was spinning. What had started as a desperate fill-in had somehow turned into a networking event. As the room emptied, Ms. Chen approached the piano once more. This time she sat on the bench beside Thomas, something that would have been unthinkable just hours ago. Play the piece again, she requested quietly. The one you wrote. City Lights, was it? Thomas nodded and began to play, acutely aware of the CEO sitting inches away. He played with all the skill and emotion he possessed, pouring years of quiet observation and hidden dreams into the music. When he finished, Ms. Chen was silent for a moment. Then she asked a question that would change everything. Mr. Rivera, how would you feel about a change in position at Belmont Tower? 3 months after that fateful night at the company party, Thomas sat in a small recording studio, listening to the playback of his latest composition. The sound engineer gave him a thumbs up through the glass. That's the one, Thomas said, smiling. I think we've got it. So much had changed since Ms. Chen had sat beside him at the piano and offered him a new position at Belmont Tower. Thomas still couldn't quite believe the turn his life had taken. Dad, Zoe burst into the studio, her school backpack still slung over one shoulder. Sorry I'm late. The science club meeting ran long. Did I miss it? Just finished, Thomas said, pulling out the chair next to him. But Jerry can play it back for you. As the engineer rewound the recording, Thomas studied his daughter's face. At 12, Zoe was on the cusp of adolescence, increasingly independent, but still eager to share in her father's new adventures. She'd been his biggest supporter through all the changes of the past few months. The music filled the small room, a piece Thomas had composed for Belmont Tower's new promotional video. It was uplifting and modern, with hints of classical influence, music that spoke of possibility and growth. It's beautiful, Dad, Zoe said when the piece ended. They're going to love it. Thomas hoped so. His new position as Belmont's artist-in-residence was both exciting and terrifying. Ms. Chen had created the role specifically for him, explaining that the company had been looking for ways to incorporate arts and culture into their corporate identity. Thomas would provide music for company events, compose original pieces for their media content, and perhaps most importantly, start a music program for the children of employees. The salary was nearly twice what he'd made as a member of the cleaning staff, and the hours were primarily during the day, meaning he could be home with Zoe in the evenings. It had been a difficult transition at first. Some executives had been skeptical about hiring a janitor, no matter how talented, for such a visible role. Thomas himself had worried that he wasn't qualified, that he would fail and end up worse off than before. but Ms. Chen had been surprisingly patient. "I believe in investing in talent," she told him during their first official meeting, "wherever it may be found." After finishing at the recording studio, Thomas and Zoe walked to their new apartment. It wasn't fancy. Thomas had been careful not to overextend financially, but it was in a safer neighborhood with an extra bedroom that he'd converted into a small music studio. Best of all, it came with a used upright piano that the previous tenant had been willing to sell at a reasonable price. "Don't forget we're having dinner at Darlene's tonight," Zoe reminded him as they climbed the stairs to their third-floor unit. "I remember," Thomas assured her. "I'm bringing dessert." Many of his friendships from the cleaning crew had survived his career change. Some, like his relationship with Darlene, had even grown stronger. Others had become strained by his sudden rise in status. Ramon in particular had been distant at first, making jokes about Thomas being too good for them now. It had taken time and effort to convince him that nothing fundamental had changed. Harold had received a promotion, too, to head of security for the executive floor. He never failed to remind Thomas that he was responsible for discovering him. "If I hadn't ratted you out, you'd still be pushing a mop," he'd say with a grin. At home, Thomas changed out of his business casual clothes, another adjustment he was still getting used to, while Zoe started her homework at the kitchen table. He was preparing to make the promised dessert when his phone rang. "Mr. Rivera, this is Michael from Happy Oaks Retirement Home." Thomas felt a pang of guilt. With his new schedule, he hadn't been able to keep up his weekly performances at the retirement home. "Hi, Michael. Is everything okay?" "Actually, I'm calling about Mr. Delaney. His health has declined rather suddenly and he's been asking for you. For your music, specifically." Thomas closed his eyes, thinking of the former music teacher who had so forcefully told him not to waste his talent. "I'll be there as soon as I can." After explaining the situation to Zoe and calling Darlene to postpone dinner, they took a bus to Happy Oaks. The familiar building looked the same, but Thomas felt different walking through its doors. No longer just a volunteer, but someone who understood more deeply the importance of what he offered there. Mrs. Henderson met them in the lobby, her face showing both concern and relief. "Thank you for coming so quickly. He's been in and out of consciousness, but he's lucid at the moment." She led them to a private room where Mr. Delaney lay in bed, looking much frailer than Thomas remembered. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. "Mr. Delaney," Thomas said softly. "It's Thomas. From the piano." The old man's eyes fluttered open, taking a moment to focus. "The maestro," he whispered, a ghost of his former enthusiasm in his voice. "You came." "Of course I came," Thomas replied, pulling a chair close to the bed. Zoe stood quietly behind him. "Did you keep your promise?" Mr. Delaney asked. "About the music?" Thomas nodded. "I did. Thanks to you, actually. You were right. I shouldn't have let it die inside me." Over the next few minutes, Thomas told Mr. Delaney about the changes in his life, the night at Belmont Tower, his new position, the recording session earlier that day. The old teacher listened with a soft smile, occasionally closing his eyes but always opening them again as if by sheer determination. "I want to hear it," Mr. Delaney said when Thomas finished. "Your music." Mrs. Henderson, who had been standing in the doorway, stepped forward. "We can bring a keyboard from the community room." 10 minutes later, a portable keyboard had been set up in the small room. It was nowhere near the quality of the Steinway at Belmont Tower, or even Thomas's upright at home, but that hardly mattered now. "What would you like to hear?" Thomas asked, sitting at the keyboard. "Your River," Mr. Delaney whispered. "The one about memory." Thomas was surprised the old man remembered the piece so specifically. He positioned his hands and began to play River of Memory, the composition he'd written after Elena's death. In the small room, with just Mr. Delaney, Zoe, and Mrs. Henderson listening, Thomas played with all the emotion he usually held in check. The music spoke of loss. Yes, but also of continuity, of how love and memory flow forward, carrying pieces of the past into the future. As he played, Thomas thought of Elena, of the dreams they'd shared, of how she would have been proud of where he was now. When the final notes faded, Mr. Delaney had tears on his cheeks. "That," he said with surprising firmness, "is why music matters. It says what words cannot." They stayed for another hour. Thomas played more pieces, some classical favorites that Mr. Delaney requested, a jazz standard, and finally, at Zoe's whispered suggestion, City Lights, the composition that had changed everything at Belmont Tower. As they were preparing to leave, Mr. Delaney reached for Thomas's hand. "You found your way back," he said, his voice now barely audible. "To where you belong." Thomas squeezed the old man's hand gently. "I had help. From you. From my daughter. From people who saw something in me that I'd stopped seeing in myself." 2 weeks later, Thomas stood on a small stage in Belmont Tower's newly renovated community space. Behind him, a group of children, including Zoe, waited with various instruments. Before him sat an audience of parents, company employees, and Ms. Chen herself in the front row. This was the debut concert of the Belmont Tower Youth Music Program, which Thomas had established as part of his new role. The children ranged in age from 7 to 15, with varying levels of musical ability. Some came from wealthy families. Others, like the daughter of one of the security guards, came from backgrounds much like Zoe's. Thomas had insisted that the program be open to all employees' children, regardless of position within the company. Ms. Chen had agreed without hesitation, and had even established a fund to provide instruments for those who couldn't afford them. "Welcome, everyone," Thomas began, slightly nervous but determined. "When I started working at Belmont Tower 4 years ago, I never imagined I'd be standing here today. Life takes unexpected turns sometimes." He glanced at Zoe, who gave him an encouraging nod. "Music has always been my passion, but for a long time I kept it hidden. I was afraid of failure, of rejection, of not being good enough. It took the kindness and insight of others to help me find my way back to it." Thomas thought of Mr. Delaney, who had passed away peacefully 3 days after their visit. The old music teacher's funeral had been held yesterday, with Thomas playing River of Memory one final time in his honor. "What I've learned," Thomas continued, "is that talent doesn't disappear when life gets hard. It waits for the right moment, the right opportunity, and sometimes that opportunity comes from the most unexpected places." He turned to the children behind him. "These young musicians have been working incredibly hard for the past 2 months. Some had never touched an instrument before joining our program. Others, like my daughter Zoe, had some previous experience. But all of them have shown dedication, courage, and joy in making music together. The concert that followed wasn't perfect. There were missed notes, timing issues, and one memorable moment when a young violinist's string broke mid-performance. But there was also real music, simple but heartfelt, played with concentration and pride. For the finale, Thomas sat at the piano, not the Steinway which remained in the executive lounge, but a good quality instrument donated by a local music store. The children gathered around him with their instruments, and together, they performed an arrangement Thomas had created of City Lights. As Thomas played, he looked out at the audience. There was Ms. Chen nodding in approval, Darlene and Ramon from the cleaning crew cheering a bit too loudly, Harold filming everything on his phone, and in the back, a group of residents from Happy Oaks, brought by Mrs. Henderson in a small tribute to Mr. Delaney. The music swelled as the children joined in, adding their simple parts to Thomas's more complex piano line. Together it created something new, a piece about not just city lights, but about community, about finding one's place, about the beauty that emerges when different voices come together. When the last note sounded, the room erupted in applause. Zoe caught Thomas's eye and beamed with pride. In that moment, Thomas felt a sense of rightness, of having finally found his way to where he was meant to be. Not famous, not wealthy, but doing what he loved. Sharing his music, teaching others, and most importantly, showing his daughter that dreams don't have to die, even when life takes unexpected turns. Later that night, as Thomas tucked an exhausted but happy Zoe into bed, she asked, "Do you think Mom would have liked the concert?" Thomas sat on the edge of her bed, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "She would have loved it. She always believed in my music even when I stopped believing in it myself. I'm glad everyone knows how good you are now," Zoe said sleepily. "You're not invisible anymore." "No," Thomas agreed softly. "I'm not invisible anymore." After Zoe fell asleep, Thomas went to his piano. In the quiet apartment with the city lights twinkling outside the window, he began to play a new piece, one that had been forming in his mind for weeks. This one wasn't about loss or memory or city lights. It was about transformation, about second chances, about finding your voice after years of silence. As his fingers moved across the keys, Thomas felt gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had led him here. From cleaning floors to creating music, from invisibility to recognition, from merely surviving to truly living. The music flowed into the night, no longer contained, no longer hidden, just as it was always meant to be.